The Loop.
The Loop. You have the divine spark. The Loop.
Do or do not. There is no try.
The Loop.
Hey there, this is Misha, and welcome to episode number 13 of The Loop. Today's guest is Eric Hudson, who is a former Amazon recruiter and bar raiser. He was in Amazon for 8 years and worked in several departments and has hired thousands and thousands of people into various roles within the organization. He's a really interesting guy and speaks really passionately about the Amazon hiring process and culture. And today's episode is very special. We very specifically focus on Amazon's culture and their 16 leadership principles. This is part one of 2 parts, and we go over the first 8 leadership principles. And Eric basically shares his perspective and a few stories around each of these principles to give a little bit more context into what they really mean. So if you are interviewing, obviously this is super relevant and important, but also if you are just interested in their culture, whether you are a hiring manager yourself or you are interested in how Amazon operates and how they hire and what they believe in, then I think this is going to be really interesting for you. So check out the first 8 principles here, and then I will also link back to the second episode in the show notes. All right, hope you enjoy. Hey Eric, how's it going?
Hey, Misha. How you doing?
I'm good. All right, man. I'm excited to jump right into this. Today, we're going to talk about the leadership principles, Amazon's 16 leadership principles, which are pretty famous about now, I think. And I think we talk about this a lot, but I really want to get into each and every single principle and get your perspective as a former hiring manager, recruiter, bar raiser who's hired thousands of people, and really get a little bit more insight and context and maybe some stories about what these principles really mean, and not just what's written on the Amazon website. So yeah, why don't we start with like a little bit about the leadership principles? Like, can you tell me about them? What are they and why are they important?
Sure. Yeah. So Amazon leadership principles, they're more than just principles, right? And the first thing you think of whenever you start to interview in this process, and if you're listening to this video and you have an Amazon interview, the first thing you're going to Google is the Amazon leadership principles, understand more about them. Amazon uses them in a way that's more of a North Star for the company. A lot of companies talk about values and different things, different pillars that they have, but they don't live and breathe them like Amazon does. Amazon looks at these 16 principles and they use them in everyday meetings. They use them in how they calculate decisions. Have backbone, for example. If someone's at a meeting and everybody's being too agreeable, someone will say, "Hey, are we having too much social cohesion here?" Right? Feel free to disagree and commit. And then someone usually will pipe in because they're bringing up leadership principles. Or I need you to have more bias fraction, aka I need more sense of urgency. Or talk about promotions. That person, they're great, but they really lack earned trust to be at the next level. We need to make sure we close that gap before we get them to the next promo. So Amazon uses them as a way to guide really the life at Amazon. I mean, you think about it and simplify, think big. Those created AWS, so they created Amazon ads. So you're talking billions and billions of dollars of revenue are produced from the leadership principles and basically fosters an innovative environment to build new things. So that's essentially the leadership principles and what they do. And and obviously it's worked. I mean, you have a company that's thriving and Jeff Bezos being the second richest man in the world. So good stuff.
Awesome, man. Yeah, thanks for that intro. So they're super important, not only in the interview process, but also in the actual job itself, right? So, you can think about it, even if you are going through the interview process and you're having to read about these principles and sort of memorize them or like understand them better. It's not just for an interview. This is actually something you're going to be using day to day. So it's pretty important to understand them and know what they really mean.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, why don't we just jump in? And I think with our first chat today, we'll probably do a couple of parts to this podcast. And I think we can probably get through the first half, the first 8, and I'll just go through them one by one, read them out loud, and then if you want to share some more context, some stories, and paint a better picture for us. So let's start with the first principle, customer obsession. Leaders start with the customer and work backwards. They work vigorously to earn and keep customer trust. Although leaders pay attention to competitors, they obsess over customers. Talk to me about that.
So, yeah, definitely. So, customer obsession is what the whole company was founded on, right? Jeff Bezos, when he was in his garage at the very beginning, started customer obsession, and he wanted a way to motivate employees and motivate shareholders to work hard. And the ultimate way to do that, and the most I guess integral way to do that would be to focus on the customer, right? Because if the customer is demanding something, that's what it's all about. As long as you're taking care of the customer, everything else is going to take care of itself, right? You're taking care of the customer. It's going to lead to downstream positivity for that customer, right? So, so basically, an interviewing for that, right? So if you're looking at like the interview process for customer obsession, you want to take a look at different things, right? So customer obsession is not just going above and beyond for a customer, right? That's one important piece to it, but there are several things that are important to customer obsession in interviewing, right? So a lot of people come to the interview preparing a customer obsession example for doing something that's rolling out the red carpet for the customer. Well, that's great. There are other areas. For example, a difficult interaction with the customer, right? Things are not going to always be good with them. So a time when you worked with a difficult customer, maybe they were 90% of your company's revenue, and 3 people left because they just didn't like working with that customer, right? And you come in and you're able to work with that difficult customer, earn their trust, and as a result, by the end of it, you're able to keep them on. They renew. You continue that existential lifeline for your company, and then also you develop that loyalty and earn trust with them, right? Same thing for driving innovation, right? Times when you worked with a customer, you got feedback from them, and you created an innovation from getting that feedback instead of saying, "Oh, thank you for that," and just focusing on your core business, building that out and saying, "Okay, let me innovate from your feedback and create something new." Going back to AWS, they were like, why don't y'all just own the server piece of this, right? Do what Oracle's doing, do it better. And that's exactly what they did, and they invested in basically pioneering a hundreds of billion-dollar industry today, right? And it also goes back to the customer being wrong, right? The customer's not always right. So what if the customer is about to make a decision that is at their own detriment, and they're about to make a decision that basically they're going to shoot themselves in the foot, right? And how do you intervene and then take that gun out of their hand and say, no, this is not for your best interest, and doing that while them being stubborn and also influencing them to come to your side, and preferably using data. So I say all of that to say, with customer obsession, it's really all about working with the customer, and like you said at the beginning, the definition, working backwards from the customer, and that's what Amazon was successful in creating, and it's why it's successful today, because when you think about Amazon, you usually think about positive things, right? Delivering within 2 days, fast delivery, very easy to use app, very easy to use interface, right? But they do that with many different things, and with AWS, and the reason that AWS is different from Azure or Google Cloud is because Amazon is not a technology company; they're a customer company, right? They're a customer-focused company, whereas Microsoft and Google is a product company, and that's why people at AWS love AWS so much. Is one, they take care of them, but they go above and beyond, and they're constantly innovating in new things. If you look at the product offering of AWS versus Azure and GCP, it's ridiculous. It's because Amazon keeps on innovating on behalf of feedback from their customers. So that's a little bit of customer obsession, and why it's so important to be prepared for it.
And this is something we were talking about before, but in terms of this list of principles, by the way, we have customer obsession is at the top, so it's like number one, and it is like one of the first or the first leadership principle, like the OG leadership principle. Is this in any way
Right.
like in ranking of like order of importance, or is it like different depending on the role?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. So it usually depends on what the role is, right? So if you're in sales, customer obsession, earn trust, deliver results, right? Those are going to be the top leadership principles picked out for you.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say you're about to interview for a role. The hiring manager typically picks the leadership principles that are the most important for that role before the interview actually begins. So for my sales analogy, that earn trust, deliver results, customer obsession are going to be at the forefront. Now, if you're a software developer, it's going to be more about dive deep, more invent and simplify, right? Because it's more specific to the skill set. And then, of course, for a function like recruiting, you need bias for action, deliver results, customer obsession, right? So while yes, customer obsession is important, it usually depends on the role itself. But I'll go ahead and say any role that you interview for, you can pretty much bank and guarantee customer obsession will be on your loop.
Got it. All right, let's move on to number 2, ownership. Leaders are owners. They think long-term and don't sacrifice long-term value for short-term results. They act on behalf of the entire company beyond just their own team. They never say, "That's not my job."
So ownership came from Jeff Bezos's childhood. When his parents owned a rental property, they had a tenant that was there for a certain amount of time. They left and they went into the rental property and they noticed that there was a Christmas tree in the middle of the living room. And they thought it was very odd that they left a Christmas tree. And as his dad or stepdad went to throw it away, he realized it was bolted to the floor. And obviously that caused a lot of damage to the home. So he wants owners and not renters of the company, which is also why every position at Amazon gets equity in some degree, right? I mean, even a warehouse associate gets a share, right? If they spend 2 years there. So he wants people to have ownership and really believe in the company and look at problems and say, that's my problem too, right? So like, for example, Amazon as a company doesn't believe in here are my lanes. I'm going to stay within these lanes, right? And that's one thing about promotions. Whenever you're about to get promoted at Amazon, they will look deeply at what have you done outside of your daily work. Okay, great. They deliver results. They check the boxes. They had great merit. That's fine. But what did they do beyond their normal job? What did they do outside of their area of responsibility and take on and own and help alleviate pains that are in different groups? Amazon doesn't believe in SMEs. It's not really something that they focus on or really like. I mean, yes, there are SMEs that are at Amazon and they need them for certain things. But Amazon really prefers and loves the general athlete that can do a lot of things. And that comes back to ownership. Being able to make commitments and owning your promises and fulfilling those promises for your stakeholders. Again, going outside your area of responsibility. Ownership is very big too, because it also goes back to owning the commitments to your stakeholders that you say that you're going to do, right? And if you're not able to do that, especially in the examples that you give, obviously they're not going to like that. But the biggest and best example you can give for ownership is talking about a time when you took on something that was outside of your area and scope of responsibility. You took it on, you owned it, you made it great, you made it successful, and then you either sent it on its way or you absorbed it into your own scope and you made a success out of it. But ownership's a big deal. That's why Jeff Bezos preaches. You may hear some of his speeches talking about this, but talking about how he wants owners and not renters. And it goes back to ownership.
Awesome. Very, very clear. And in terms of interview questions that might be asked around that, are there any specific interview questions that you can sort of pick up on around this principle, or are they just sort of looking for that in general?
Yeah. Typically they'll ask, tell me about a time you went outside your area of responsibility. What happened? How did you handle it? What was the outcome? Tell me about a time when you made a commitment and you were not able to deliver that commitment as promised, right? So
Mhm.
then they look at that question as ownership of, okay, you're not able to fulfill a commitment that you gave, right? How do you respond to that adversity, and how are you able to make things right and take ownership of that thing, right? Not to fall on the sword,
Mhm.
but how do you learn from that, and how are you able to capitalize on the customer through additional ownership after you have faltered? So those are two
Cool.
questions that they typically ask,
Great.
and really just your examples need to be focused on how you're able to take on an area that was outside your area of responsibility.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. So let's move on to the third principle: invent and simplify. Leaders expect and require innovation and invention from their teams and always find ways to simplify. They are externally aware, look for new ideas from everywhere, and are not limited by not invented here. As we do new things, we accept that we may be misunderstood for long periods of time.
Yeah, so invent and simplify is a major leadership principle. I mean, without invent and simplify, Amazon wouldn't be where it is today. And I mean, if you think about invent and simplify, like think about Amazon, right? It was a bookstore, an online bookstore, and then it turned into an everything store, and then it turned into a primary everything store where as a first party seller, and then it turned into a third party seller, and then you got AWS, which is now $70 billion run rate, and it was only 12 years ago that it was created. And on top of that, you have Amazon Ads, right? Which is, a lot of people don't realize this, but Amazon Ads is actually bigger than YouTube's ad revenue, and all of that would not be possible without innovation. The great thing about Invent Simplify too is it's one of the easier leadership principles to answer if you get that in your interview. For example, every question they ask you is basically the same question. They basically ask 9 different times the same thing, which is, tell me about a time when you took a complex problem and you solved it with an innovative solution, or tell me about a time when tell me about the most innovative thing you've done in your career. Tell me about a time when you had to take feedback from a manager and then you were able to innovate yourself from it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So ultimately, everything is about innovation and creating some kind of simplified solution. Another thing is Amazon loves to see examples around automation of manual processes. So if you have a manual process and you talk about how do you innovate that manual process into something that's automated, right? They're going to love that because Amazon loves efficiency, and efficiency is gained, right? Another thing about Amazon, and this is where it's kind of funny, is a lot of people come to Amazon thinking Amazon has everything figured out, and when they get there and they realize Amazon's really kind of put together with duct tape. And so the reason for that is because Amazon doesn't believe that one process is the one true king, right? Just like Uber, it can be disrupted, or just like the taxi business, it can be disrupted, like what Uber did, right? So the same thing with every other process. That's what Amazon's based on. And you really want to think about examples where you were able to challenge the status quo of what things were, and you were able to innovate and elevate the innovation around an area, right? It doesn't have to be, something that's super big every time, like Amazon Marketplace or AWS. But when you took an example and took a situation and you innovated it, it made it better.
Awesome. Yeah, very clear. Sounds like a pretty important principle, like you mentioned, right? Like these first three are pretty key to everything Amazon is doing. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, let's move on to number 4, which sounds a little bit weird. So I'd love to get some more context on it. Are right a lot. Leaders are right a lot. They have strong judgment and good instincts. They seek diverse perspectives and work to disconfirm their beliefs.
Yep. Are right a lot. It almost sounds like it's grammatically incorrect. But a right a lot's important. A right a lot goes back to judgment, right? Judgment, intuition, experience. Have you been there? If you're an L7 interviewing for an L7 role, you'll notice that this leadership principle is it's going to be in your interview, and it's going to be in most L7 interviews, just because they want to see your experience and they want to see your judgment skills, right? And that question goes back to a lot of very difficult questions And what they can ask in that for write a lot goes back to, sometimes you not being right, and how do you rectify that, right? So, for example, tell me about a time you made a bad decision, right? How did you make a bad decision, and what did you do? And a lot of times, people get spun up in the bad decision, and then ending the example in the bad decision, when in fact they actually don't care about that. They want to see how you overcome the adversity of making the bad decision, what you learn from it, and how you're able to create success from that bad decision, right? Same thing for tell me about a time when you had an error in judgment, right? They want to see how you learn from those errors in judgment, and how you were able to take those into the future and create success from it, right? It goes back to what? Judgment. And, you've been there, you've done that. How do you take it in the future, and how do you make it better, right? It also looks at, how you make decisions on the fly without data. And the whole interview with Amazon is about how do you use data. Our Write a Lot is a one leadership principle where they don't really care about that. They want to see how you're using your gut. They want to see how you make a decision in the moment. There's even a question that says, tell me about a time when you had to make a decision without any data, and where did that result in? But Write a Lot is one of the more polarizing examples. And when you go through the writing exercise, they actually give you two options. One is for a Write a Lot. They ask about a Write a Lot, and they ask about Invent and Simplify. And I usually tell people not to choose Write a Lot because it's such a hard leadership principle to answer. Because if I asked you, what do you think about a certain politician and their decision-making skills, it's going to be polarizing, depending on who you ask. If I ask you, do you think the iPhone is innovative? You're going to say, yeah, of course it's innovative, right? You'd be a dummy not to think that. So I always recommend going with the Invent and Simplify one. But that's all Write a Lot, and it really goes back to your gut, your judgment, and your instinct.
I had a question about what I hear as like the failure story, and this is something that comes up, and I don't really know what leadership principle is that talking about. Is it this one, or what an Amazon interviewer asks you about a time that you had a project that was not successful, and what did you learn from that experience? What is that? What principle does that match up to?
That's Write a Lot.
Okay.
It's around the money. So Write a Lot is usually what I like to call the uncomfortable leadership principle, because it asks you all those questions, right? A bad decision, an error in judgment, right? There are other ones that have that negative sentiment. Earn trust has a question that's, tell me about a time when you made a critical piece of feedback. You had a critical piece of feedback from your manager. How did you handle it, and how did you overcome it? And a lot of people have trouble answering that question just because, your manager giving tough feedback, and if you're not prepared to answer that question in front of someone you want to impress, right, that could be really hard for you to answer, right? So, and then there's a few others, right? I believe it's for, I think it's ownership, actually. Ownership, asks you, like, tell me about a time you made a commitment and you couldn't deliver it as promised, right? That's very hard to answer, and a paradox when you have someone who is, trying to hire you and you want to impress them, and then they're asking you these very difficult situations. So, and Backbone. Backbone's also very hard, very uncomfortable, because it's asking you when you disagree with your manager, disagree with your peers, disagree with your stakeholders, and that puts you in an uncomfortable situation too. But your ultimate goal is you want to show how you navigate it, learn from it, and ultimately come out successful. And you want to try and not tell a story where you're not coming out successful. So
there's quite a few.
That's my.
There's quite a few that make you uncomfortable. It sounds like it's not just like one. Yeah.
Well, definitely. Yeah. There's a few for sure, but those are the main ones.
Awesome. All right, let's move on to the next one. Learn and be curious. Leaders are never done learning and always seek to improve themselves. They are curious about new possibilities and act to explore them. This one seems really straightforward and easy. I mean, do you find this is like pretty easy for most people, or what? What can you add to it?
Yeah, I mean, it is straightforward, right? And it actually, this used to be vocally self-critical, was the leadership principle, and learn to be curious actually replaced it, because people were being too vocally self-critical to the point where it was getting a little unhealthy in the culture. So they said, okay, well, how can we make this a little bit more positive? And They created Learn to Be Curious because they wanted to see your learning capabilities, right? And then this comes from Google. In Google's early days, they wanted smart people. And smart people know how to learn quickly. They have a steep learning curve. They can learn quickly. They can get in there. It doesn't take them long. They can train other people in a matter of months, right? So they're subject matter expert. They've learned it. They're teaching it back, right? It goes back to that. And it goes back to learn new things. One of the best examples you can give, especially if they ask, tell me about a time when you had to use something that you learned outside of work and you were able to apply it, is an example where maybe you had to go learn Japanese or Spanish or whatever language it was to do your job better, or maybe you had to you weren't very good at Excel and you're taking forever to do things, and you were able to learn Excel, become a wizard at it, and you're able to create a lot more efficiency in your day. Or if you want to take it on a bigger scale, right, you learn how to code, and you had a project where you needed to hire an engineer, but you couldn't afford an engineer because it's a startup. We're getting scrappy, right? We need to be bootstrapped, and so you code, and then you take that coding and you ultimately code yourself and learn. And it's all because you learned something outside of work and brought it into your day to day and incorporated that and created a learning mechanism that allowed you to, of course, learn something new and then create impact, right? And that's another big thing is, what impact did it create? And I can't emphasize this more. And all of these leadership principles that we're going over, that you have to show the impact that you created, because at the end of the day, they're taking your past examples and they're dropping it in the future of Amazon, and they're saying, do these show future impact here? And if you're not showing that and you're not doing that, then it's not clear that you're going to be the winner that they're going to hire.
Right.
So
right.
that's Learn to Be Curious, and yeah, it's all about learning and taking a steep learning curve to success.
Yeah, I want to highlight what you just said about the impact, because it's really easy to say, like, oh, I like watching YouTube videos about AI, and yeah, I'm learning a lot of stuff and that's helped me in my job. And it's like, that's a super vague answer, even though you're maybe a really curious person and you know a lot about the topic. But like you said, what is that? Like, so what, right? Like, a lot of people watch YouTube videos and maybe get into certain topics. Like, how have you used that in the actual job, and what has been the tangible result or outcome? So just tying into that point.
Right.
Cool.
Exactly.
All right. Let's move on to the next one. Hire and develop the best. Leaders raise the performance bar with every hire and promotion. They recognize exceptional talent and willingly move them throughout the organization. Leaders develop leaders and take seriously their role in coaching others. We work on behalf of our people to invent mechanisms for development like career choice. What is career choice, by the way? Just talk about that.
Yeah, basically, it's at Amazon. They have a saying: you own your own development. So you can't just depend on your manager to just groom and coach you every single minute of the day. You are empowered to own your own development, and that's basically career choice, and your ability to make decisions on behalf of your career, which is fostered with Hire and Develop the Best.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
All right. So talk to me more about this principle and why it's important, maybe for, of course, managers and leaders, but also someone that's maybe not in a people management role.
Yeah. Well, it's, if you are in a people management role, or you're interviewing for a manager, or you're interviewing for a senior manager role, Hire and Develop the Best is just imperative, right? And if you don't do well in Hire and Develop the Best, you're definitely not getting L7 roles. You're probably getting down leveled to L6. And if you're L6 manager, you might be getting down leveled to L6 IC if you don't perform well on this. So for Hire and Develop the Best, there's a couple things to it, right? First of all, you have to make people better, right? And especially if you are an IC, like the difference between an L5 IC and an L6 IC at Amazon is you can put an L6 IC in a room bunch of L5s and they're all better when you leave the room, right? So from an IC perspective, they want to see how you help your peers who might be struggling, how you elevate them, how you make them better. Are you a mentor to them? Are you getting them the resources that they need, the training that they need? How are you doing that? Are you working with them on onboarding, right? On the manager level, right, there's many different pieces to that, right? how do you construct a team, right? How do you keep a high bar when you're hiring talent? They won't tell you this in any manager book, but if you don't hire good talent, right, it doesn't matter. They teach you how to manage, but if hiring good talent is the main thing. So that's one thing that they always look at is, tell me how you construct a team. How do you put together a team? How do you build a team? Another thing that's very important, especially today with the Great Resignation and Great Reshuffle, Amazon has really been emphasizing this a lot in their interviews, especially with L7s and L6s, is how do you retain top talent? How are you keeping top talent? How do you elevate your top talent, right? How do you fight for promotions in past examples, right? And then another thing is low performers. You're always going to get this question if you're a manager. So low performers, how do you work with them, right? And you usually can go two routes. You can say, I had a low performer, they weren't doing well, they may have just not been motivated, they had the skills to do it, and you got them what they needed to do to get them to that next level, to get them performing, to get them back to where they need to be, and bonus points if you can get that person promoted or show some kind of growth there. The other one is, and I actually recommend you don't go this path unless they ask for it, is how do you manage a low performer out and how do you let them go, right? Are you socializing with HR? Are you working with them? Are you documenting? How do you know is the right time to put them on a PIP? You got to make sure too much time doesn't pass by because it looks like that you're kicking the can down the road. It goes back to Jim Collins' book, Good to Great, right? Getting the right people on the right seats of the bus, right? And if they're not in the right seats of the bus, get them in the right seat. And if they don't want to be on the bus, get them off the bus, right? So that's hard to build the best. And I mean, it's imperative if you're a manager, you have to have it. And then if you're an IC, especially if you're trying to vie for an L6 role, you really want to show how you've helped peers who are struggling and how you help peers who are onboard and how you were able to get up to speed. So that's hard to build the best.
Awesome. Yeah, very clear. Let's do a couple more here. So I think that was number 6. All right, so here's the 7th one. Insist on the highest standards. Leaders have relentlessly high standards. Many people may think these standards are unreasonably high. Leaders are continually raising the bar and drive their teams to deliver high-quality products, services, and processes. Leaders ensure that defects do not get sent down the line and that problems are fixed so they stay fixed. It's a big one.
Yeah, it is a big one. And it's actually one of my favorite leadership principles. I think by the time I left Amazon, it was my favorite. Earn trust was my favorite for pretty much my whole career there. But as I left Amazon, I realized that insisting on high standards was my favorite. And I embody it today, being a coach and helping people insist on higher standards for themselves, right? So for insist on high standards, it goes back to bar raising, and it goes back to if you look at the very first job description that Jeff Bezos wrote, he talks about I needed someone who can do 10x what a normal engineer does and can take requests that some people think are unreasonable and accomplish them in a big way, right? So insist on highest standards goes back to quality, right? Quality, not speed. So hiring great talent, right? Making sure that you're prioritizing the best talent that you have, making sure that your processes are tight and that you're taking a process that takes 30 steps and get down to 1 step, right? Or taking, helping your sales reduce obstacles so they can focus on building and growing revenue, right? Everything on System Highest Standards is how you take and challenge what's going on currently and insisting on those higher standards and creating a higher bar for yourself, for your team, for your company. And again, going back to that impact statement, I beat my clients over the head with the impact stuff, but how are you creating an impact in your previous job by focusing on increasing the standard of how things are, and challenging it and saying, yeah, good enough is not good enough. Your current and your previous employers. So that's just on the highest standards, and it's really just about challenging that status quo and saying how can we enhance things.
Awesome. And do you have any examples of questions that might be asked based on this principle?
So I kind of sprinkled those in there as I was talking. So one of those is, tell me about a time when you challenged that status quo, right? Tell me about a time when you prioritized speed or quality versus speed, right? Tell me about a time when you looked at a process and said, this isn't good enough, and you challenged what was good and made it great. So that's a few that they usually ask, and focusing again on how you're enhancing and making um, your department, your team, and your company better.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. Let's do one more. Think big. Thinking small is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Leaders create and communicate a bold direction that inspires results. They think differently and look around corners for ways to serve customers.
So think big is another big leadership principle for L7. If you don't have think big, it's very unlikely that they will hire you as L7. They'll probably bring you in as L6 and say they need to work on their think big. But think big is also big for product managers who also work on a lot of roadmaps. But strategy, roadmap, vision, that's think big. And how are you looking around corners, and how are you seeing things that are going to happen and I mean really in the future, right? So I mean, like, AWS was such a think big idea, right? I mean, they had big visions of what cloud computing was going to do, and they knew it. They thought big, and they basically saw the future, and it came to fruition, right? So you really tie think big with innovation, and tie it next to how you want to build what that next idea is, right? And I think I mentioned this to you before, but like think big also relates to, like, if I said, in 10 years we're going to make Keras a job platform, right? And we really invest in making this a job platform, even though we're a coaching platform currently. And in 10 years, that's our biggest revenue source, right? It's kind of like Netflix. Netflix said we're going to go into streaming, and Wall Street was like, "You guys are crazy. What is streaming? I want to go to my local Blockbuster store and pick up a movie with my family, right? There's no way that one day I'm just going to want to sit in the comfort of my own home and want to stream this on a TV." But it is what it is today. And I mean, video stores are almost extinct. So that's think big. And you want to think about some of the things that you've done in your career where you've been able to think big and make, and basically say, okay, I'm going to implement this process that's going to create this. And then it has long-term value and implications and creates value for the customer. So that's think big, really looking around corners, and almost kind of fortune telling in a way, right? Like looking at, like, here's what I view, here's what I deduced, right? Doing the math of everything. This is what success is going to look like, and here's the plan that we're going to do to get there, and then it come into fruition. So
yeah, you
big.
mentioned like strategy and vision and road mapping, and for a PM, for sure, you don't necessarily, that's just like a PM's job. You don't have to be in a senior PM role. But for someone in like a junior marketing role, or software developer, or someone that's coming in like an L4, L5, how does this play out? Like, how do you, like, maybe you're thinking big, but like, do you frame it a little bit differently? How do I think about that?
Yeah, I mean, you also got to remember that for each level, the bar is going to be not lower, but the scope is not expected to be that big, right? So, and also it's highly unlikely for L4 that think big is going to be tied to them, right? It's just very rare that that's going to be a circumstance, right? Like, you don't expect an L4 admin to be able to think big, right? What they're doing is very transactional in the day-to-day and delivering results and bias for action. L4 and L5 is really more based on your merit. And then when you start to get in L6, getting promotions is more based on the think big piece, right? So, like, not saying that L4, L5 do not get asked that. I've definitely seen many instances where think big gets applied, but it's think big in a smaller way, right? So maybe think big from like a process creation that you did, and that was able to create enhancements for your team, right? Or maybe there was a hiring process that was very messy, and the business was saying one thing, finance was saying one thing, TA was saying one thing, HR was saying one thing, and you said, okay, I'm going to create a mechanism where you fill out this Google form, it populates this sheet. I'm going to have a standing meeting where we approve these recs, and then when we approve these recs from our executive leadership team with finance in the room, that means that we can roll out and we'll add them to this master spreadsheet that's the one source of truth, right? So all of a sudden you had a messy process, and now you've been able to condense it and create something systematically that's going to make everyone better. And it's and you were the common denominator in making that think big change. And while that's and that's not like the huge think big that an executive would do, but it's more of like what L5 PM would do. So that's think big in that context, and how you can use it in your examples and your interviews.
Is there also, like, when you're preparing for these, like you just said, you're preparing for these leadership principles, you're coming up with some stories, some examples from your past that you can share in the interview, and some are more important than others depending on your role, depending on your level. Would you recommend that someone always prepares at least one of these, or thinks about one story for each single principle, no matter what the role? Or are there cases where you're coming in for a level 4, level 5, non-management individual contributor role, where you can just pretty much ignore a couple of the principles? What do you think about that?
Well, if you're L4, you can definitely ignore think big, I think. There might be a rare case that you have to get it, but there are certain ones that you're definitely not going to get. Like, unless you're in finance, you're not going to get frugality. You can go ahead and just knock it off your list. Frugality is the forgotten leadership principle in the interview. And again, the only ones I've ever seen it on are finance. No one else has gotten frugality. But here's the thing. You don't know what leadership principles they're going to pick. I advise my clients to always ask, especially when you go with Amazon, is to ask the recruiter, can you tell me what leadership principles are going to be on this interview? And it depends on who the recruiter is. Some recruiters will tell you. They'll tell you blatantly what the leadership principles are. And then you can take that and you can surmise, right? Like, okay, I have 10 leadership principles. I can take these 6 and push them away and focus on these 10. And then I would only come up with examples for those 10 leadership principles if that's what they told you. But in the case where the recruiter doesn't give you that information, you're kind of SOL. And you have to really prepare an example for every leadership principle. Or, what happens if you don't think of an example for think big, and they ask a think big question, you're not going to do well. It's a curveball, right? You could try, but you want to be able to create something, at least something, 1 or 2 leadership principles for all of them if you don't know.
Got it.
So
yeah, man, super clear. So I think we can wrap things up for this episode. We've got the first 8 principles down. I think we can do round 2 hopefully soon. Knock out the other 8. There's also 2 new principles on there. I'm curious to hear about those. I haven't talked too much about those with anyone. So we can dig into that pretty soon. Is there anything else you want to share, or any advice you have around these first 8 principles that we covered?
Not specifically around the leadership principles, but I would just say, for those who are listening, as you're creating your examples, right? Like, think about what the level is and just make sure you're looking at the scope of it. If you're L6 and L7, you really should be working with executive level stakeholders in your examples, and you should be focusing on, influencing them with data and what impact that creates, right? That's super important. But I would say for the 8 leadership principles we discussed today, I think we covered most of it. But just challenge yourself and say, not a transactional day-to-day example, but what big transformational moment am I proud of in my career that I was able to demonstrate this? And that's what it's going to take to get a job at Amazon. You cannot half bake an example in leadership principles that we discussed and get a job. You're just not. You can't wing it. Which is why we do what we do, and I recommend hiring a coach, preferably me, if you decide to prep for your interview.
Awesome.
So that's my advice.
Thanks so much, Eric. Let's do round 2 soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Misha.
Alrighty. I hope you liked that conversation, and I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the principles that I didn't know. It's really good to just have someone super experienced that's worked there clarify what all these mean. I think sometimes, you can just like read online and just search for information endlessly, but it's good to hear it directly from someone who's hired people and use these principles for screening and on a day-to-day basis. So it's pretty cool to hear him talk about them. So if you are interested to talk more about these, to get help with your interview preparation, whether it's Amazon or anywhere else, I of course recommend Eric. You sort of got a sense of his style and knowledge and approach as well from this conversation. So I will link back to his coaching profile. I recommend you you have a quick chat with him. You can message him, have a free call, and get help with whatever your goals are. I will also link back to episode number 2 of this. We're going to record this shortly, so by the time this is live, you will be able to click on that in the show notes and also hear the second part with the other 8 leadership principles. So hope you enjoy that. If you have any other questions, comments, feedback, if there's something else that we missed in this that you want to hear about, let me know. We can always do another podcast. Eric's got a ton of knowledge and info to share. And if you would like to talk to me about any of that, then you can also just reach out to me by email. And I've got my contact info in the show notes. So if you want to get more updates, please subscribe to wherever you subscribe to podcasts or on YouTube. And I will see you next week. All right, take care.